The pillars were covered with red velvet, over 200 wax candles burned around and next to the high altar. As in parts 1 and 2 of the series, the search continues, why Saint Cecilia became the patron saint of music. Check out part 1, the Passio Saint Cecilia, and part 2, Crypt of Saint Cecilia. In the 9th century, the Basilica of Santa Cecilia was built in Trastevere, Rome, at the spot where, according to the Passion story, Cecilia died her martyr's death. Cecilia was buried in the Callisto catacombs in the 3rd century and transferred to this basilica in the 9th century. When her coffin was opened in the basilica in 1599, her body was found intact. In 1600, a statue of Cecilia was made to immortalize this miracle. Next to the statue you can see a relief. It shows Saint Cecilia playing the organ. Is this relief the starting point where Cecilia became associated with music? Of course it's much more complicated, but let's try to figure it out. Archaeology. Before the basilica was built, other Roman buildings already stood on the same spot. Archaeological excavations try to solve this puzzle. Rough insight into the discovered prehistory of the basilica. Red, floor plan of the basilica. White, archaeological 3D floor plan. A report tells about 3 previous construction phases. Phase 1. The time before Cecilia lived here is said to have been a domus, a Roman townhouse of wealthy upper-class families. Phase 2. The time when Cecilia may have lived here is said to have been an insula. The insula was a Roman apartment building with several floors, which was inhabited by several parties, and stores on the ground floor. There was probably a utility room with storage shafts for food or tannery. A bathing structure was discovered that suggests partial residential use. The insula survived maybe into the 3rd century, despite some modifications. There are fragmentary indications that a domus may have been built again after the insula. Remodeling work was done in the bathing structure. A round basin, covered with a marble slab, was created. This basin has probably been used as a baptismal basin. Today the basin is located under the reliquary chapel. A balneum was discovered, about 8 meters away from this basin. It is possible that this bathing room is connected to the Passio of Cecilia. After the burial place of Saint Cecilia, in the Callisto catacombs, we have now also found the place where Cecilia died. It is said that parts of the bathroom are still preserved today, under the chapel of the bath. If you want to know more about the archaeological research about the time before the basilica was built, please read these reports. The first church. In part 1 of the series we learn, Cecilia was executed in her own bathroom. While she was dying, she asked Bishop Urban to convert her home into a church. Archaeological finds have shown that a bathhouse existed on the spot where the basilica now stands and where Cecilia may lived and where she died. Whether this bath was part of the insula, or the previous or following domus, has not been clarified in the archaeological studies. Today's basilica was built in the 9th century. Whether a church was actually blessed or built by Urban, on the spot of Cecilia's death, in the 3rd century, has not been confirmed. But the first mention of a church on the spot is possibly found on an epitaph from the 4th to 5th century period. In 499 it is confirmed that there was already a church at the spot. The Liber Pontificalis reports that Pope Vigilius celebrated the titular feast in the Church of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere in 545. No clear foundations of this mentioned first church have been found till today, which allows at least speculations. Possibility 1. The domus or insula was cored and converted into a church. Possibility 2. The foundations of the church are located outside the archaeological investigated area. Possibility 3. The first church was completely demolished, and the new basilica was built on its foundations in the 9th century. Paschalis 1, Basilica. The Basilica Santa Cecilia was built in the 9th century, around 821–822, by order of Pope Paschal I. It is said, built on the spot where the previously mentioned titulus Church of Cecilia stood. Today we see a mixture of a Baroque church with Gothic ancient influences. The basilica originally looked completely different than today. Construction Phase 1, how the original layout from the 9th century looked like. At first time the building was a classic basilica, with a central nave and 2 side aisles. The central nave was supported by 12 columns on each side, which are connected by arches. The columns probably had Ionic bases and Corinthian capitals that supported the arcades. There was a round arched window above each arcade. An open roof structure. The first main altar was probably at the same floor level as the nave floor. The basilica had one time a cosmatesque floor, which was later replaced by tiles. A similar architectural layout of the church interior can still be found today in the Basilica of San Giovanni a Porta Latina or in the Santa Sabina al Ventino, or in the Basilica Sant Polinar in Classe, Ravenna. Under the altar there was probably also a small ring crypt with a confessional area. The altar area was placed in a semicircular apse decorated with a mosaic. The apse used to have 3 windows, which were later bricked up. According to some sources, the mosaic originally also covered the 2 side sections, similar as can be seen in the Basilica Santa Maria. The apse mosaic. The apse mosaic was commissioned by Pope Paschal I in the 9th century. You can see on the far left, Pope Paschalis with a building in his hand and a rectangular halo. This shows that Paschalis was the builder and commissioner of the basilica, and that he was still alive at the time the mosaic was created. Above Paschalis sits a phoenix on a palm tree, a symbol of the resurrection. Next to Paschalis is Saint Cecilia in a Byzantine princess robe and a diadem or crown. She puts her arm around Paschalis. The next one is St. Paul, holding a book in his hand. In the center, oversized, we see Jesus Christ. In his hand he holds a scroll, above him the hand of God with a wreath. Next comes St. Peter, with a key in his hand. St. Valerian, Cecilia's husband, follows with a martyr's crown in his hand. On the far right, you can see St. Agatha, dressed as a Byzantine princess and holding a martyr's crown. In the past, Saint Agatha and Saint Cecilia were switched the position in the mosaic interpretation. Below the saints you can see 6 lambs coming from Jerusalem on the left, and 6 lambs coming from Bethlehem on the right, which represents the 12 apostles. They walk to the center to the Lamb of God, Agnus Dei. Below it is a dedication text by Pope Paschalis. The mosaic dates from the 9th century, and even here no connection between music and Saint Cecilia can be recognized. Almost all sources confirm that there was an atrium in front of the basilica. In the middle of the atrium there was a vase, called a cantharus. The atrium was destroyed during renovation or construction work. No traces of the atrium have survived, but it may have looked similar to the atrium of the Church of St. Ambrogio. The baptismal basin from the 5th century, which now is beneath the surface, was probably still in use. A Wikipedia source also refers to a narthex that existed. If there was a narthex in the first construction phase. In the case of an atrium, the part connected to the church can also be called narthex. The transfer of the relics. As we know from part 2 of the series, due to constant devastation and looting of the catacombs outside Rome, the relics of the martyrs began to be moved to churches within the city walls. Pope Paschalis transferred the relics of Cecilia from the catacombs to the newly built basilica. The relics of Valerian, Tiberius and Maximus, and the relics of Popes Urbina and Lucius I were also transferred in the basilica. With the exception of Lucius, these are important characters in the Passio of Saint Cecilia, now reunited in the Basilica of Santa Cecilia. The relics were placed in 3 new marble coffins. The coffins were placed under the altar in the new basilica. Construction Phase 2, Additions and Modifications. Chapel of the Bath. In the Chapel of the Bath, a cosmatesque floor was found that dates back to the 11th century at the latest. A document from 1073 mentions that an altar was consecrated in Cecilia's bath, which indicates this chapel. There may have been a floor-level adjustment, and parts of the Cecilia bathhouse were moved into the bath's chapel. The atrium was destroyed during renovation or construction work on the neighboring monastery buildings, probably in the 12th century. The atrium was replaced by a porticus. The new portico probably looks similar to a 16th century drawing of the basilica. A mosaic strip on the portico, which is still preserved today, also dates from the 12th century. There is a portrait above each pillar and a cross between the pillars. The portraits are currently identified as Cecilia, Agatha, Tiberius, Pope Urban and Pope Lucius. You can also see a tower in the drawing from the 16th century. The tower, campanile, was also added in the 12th century. The neighboring monastery has a cloister built onto the southwest wall. In the following centuries, the neighboring monasteries were rebuilt and extended several times. The monastery, which was consecrated by Pope Paschal in the 9th century, had several owners and administrators over the course of time. The patron saints of the monastery are Saint Cecilia and Saint Agatha. The first major changes to the interior of the church began in the 13th century. The church was decorated with a ciborium. The 4 columns made of black and white marble originate from a former ciborium. The Easter candlestick next to it probably also dates from the 13th century. Interior decoration by Pietro Cavallini. In a scientific research report of the Max Planck Institute for Art History, I found drawings of partial reconstructions and geometric side segments of the basilica in the 13th century. I tried to roughly recreate this segment of a simulated architecture painting as a 3D model and integrate it into my basilica model. In the report there is also a drawing of the entire central nave view. I used these floor plans of the basilica as a guide. I have now combined the nave side view from the 13th century with the floor plan. What led to this result? The research report of the Max Planck Institute is mainly focused on Pietro Cavallini, who redesigned the interior in the 13th century. The segments of the central nave that I recreated in 3D were simulated architectural frame decorations, which showed a fresco cycle with scenes from the Old and New Testaments. According to the report, only 10% of the Cavallini paintings are still preserved today. Most of this 10% are on the back wall. And partial impression of what the interior decoration by Pietro Cavallini might have looked like. The fresco had several levels. Further modifications 13th to 15th century. The baptistry was filled in to raise the floor level. The Ponciani chapel also seems to have been built at this time, above the baptismal. A fresco from the 13th century shows the apparition of Saint Cecilia to Pope Paschal. You can already see this image in part 2 of the series, where it appears in a History of Santa Cecilia book by Antonio Bosio. It was formerly in the loggia and was moved to this location in 1785 to preserve it. In the following 2 centuries, there were only minor structural changes. The monastery. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Benedictine nuns moved into the neighboring monastery. 1585, the Accademia Nazionale di Santa Cecilia was founded. 2 patron saints are mentioned for the new Accademia, Gregory the Great and Saint Cecilia. The first seat of the Academy was in the Church of Santa Maria ad Martiris, known as the Pantheon. The nuns of Santa Cecilia provide a location for this newly founded academy. And between 1652 and 1661, the Accademia had its main seat in the monastery. As we will see later in another part of the series, this music academy had a great influence on why Cecilia was associated with music. In 1586, the nuns commissioned Pomerencio to paint a cycle of frescoes from the life of Saint Cecilia in the apse, what no longer exists. Pomerencio's style. The Miracle. A holy year was proclaimed for the year 1600. Cardinal Paolo Emilio Sfondrati financed a restoration of the interior of the basilica. Part of the renovation was a rearrangement of the relics of the saints. 1599. The 3 coffins that were placed under the altar were found. It is said, Cecilia appeared to Caterina Paluzzi and shown her the location of her body under the altar. An opening of the coffins was arranged, under witnesses. They found the body intact, and said to still be in the position she experienced her martyrdom, in her own bath. The following events that led to mass hysteria in Rome will be covered in the next part of the series. Cecilia, or her coffin, was placed in public in the basilica until November 22nd, and then ceremoniously reburied under the altar with the other found relics. Before the burial, parts of the corpses were also removed and passed on as relics. Stefano Maderno, a sculptor from Rome, was commissioned by Sfondrati to make a statue of Cecilia to document this miracle. 1600, the young Stefano Maderno had already completed the sculpture. He says that he created Cecilia as he saw her in the coffin. The sculpture was placed at the front under the altar, the place where Cecilia was found during the renovation work. An incredible, beautiful, realistic portrayal of a suffering human being. Maderno also designed the bronze reliefs on both sides of the statue. On the left are Valerian, Cecilia, and Tiberius. On the right are Pope Lucius I, Pope Urbina and Maximus. There is an inscription by Stefano Maderno on the front of the floor, below the statue. But stop. Why does Cecilia have now a musical instrument in her hand? This is maybe the first depictions of Saint Cecilia with a musical instrument in the Basilica Santa Cecilia in Trastevere, Rome. But not the first depiction of Saint Cecilia with a musical instrument at all. The relief was probably inspired by Raphael, the Ecstasy of Saint Cecilia. Raphael painted this as early as 1516, more than 80 years before. Which means that the origin of associating Cecilia with musical instruments is probably not to be found in the Basilica of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere, Rome. The relief shows us that Cecilia's connection with musical instruments began at least 80 years before the coffin was opened in 1599. Further modifications by Cardinal Sfondrati. At this time, Cecilia was already the patron saint of music. At this time, almost every picture of Cecilia featured a musical instrument. Cardinal Sfondrati also commissioned the painter Guido Reni to paint Cecilia for the Chapel of the Bath. 1601, Guido Reni, The Beheading of Saint Cecilia. On display in an altar, in the Chapel of the Bath. Raphael's Cecilia was probably also painted in the dome of the Chapel of the Bath. Another chapel was probably built around 1600, Chapel of the Crucifixion. Sfondrati continued to commission artists to design the interior. The side aisles were painted. Additional altars were placed there in the course of the following years. Sfondrati, the patron and titular cardinal of the Basilica, died in 1618. A monument was erected in his honor in the Basilica. funerary monument to Cardinal Paolo Emilio Sfondrati. The monument was moved in the 20th century. A similar statue of Saint Cecilia, with an organ at her feet, can also be found in St. Peter's Square. The recent renovations also destroyed the last fragments of the former atrium. In the 17th century, the nuns built a crypt for their convent. Major changes were made to the interior in the 18th century. Between the 13th and the 18th century, a women's gallery was built. Unfortunately, I was unable to find out whether the gallery existed before or after the opening of Cecilia's coffin in 1599. In a report I saw a picture of a reconstruction of what the gallery might have looked like. This was also the inspiration for me to choose the additional installation of the gallery in my 3D model. In this reconstruction, you can also see the decoration on the side walls of the apse. From 1712, the titular Cardinal Francesco Acquaviva commissioned a redesign of the interior. A barrel vault in the Baroque style was installed. The windows were adapted to the new vault. The galleries were cladded. A nun's choir was built above the entrance area, so that the nuns from the neighboring monastery could participate in the masses. The cosmatesque floor was removed and replaced with tiles. On the rear side, the view of the 13th century fresco by Pietro Cavallini was completely covered by the nuns' choir. There was probably already a kind of narthex before the nuns' choir. Indication of this is a fresco in the vault of today's entrance hall. Ceiling fresco in the entrance hall. A source tells the fresco was painted in preparation for the 1600 Jubilee. We see that the artist has placed an organ in the background. On the other side you may also see an organ, but I could not clearly identify it as an organ. Around 1725, Sebastiano Conca created the central ceiling fresco for the barrel vault. Glory of Santa Cecilia in Santa Cecilia. The organ, that can be seen, already takes up a very large part of the overall picture. The reliquary chapel was also redesigned in the 18th century. The frescoes of the Chapel of the Relics were painted by Luigi Vanvitelli, also known as Ludwig van Widdel. Organs can be recognized in both paintings by Luigi Vanvitelli. In connection with Cecilia, the organ became increasingly important from the 16th to the 18th century in the pictorial design. What also can be seen in the picture is that Cecilia is playing now another instrument than an organ. The exterior of the basilica also made major changes in the 18th century. Facade renovation. Cardinal Francesco Acquaviva d'Aragona also commissioned a redesign of the facade. The portico was kept roughly as it was built in the 12th century. The mosaic strip from the 12th century has been preserved. The inscription reads, Franciscus, titula Sanctae Ceciliae, Cardinalis de Acquaviva. Above a balustrade with 6 flaming urns. Only the central nave has a facade. 3 large windows now illuminate the nuns' choir. At the top, again 6 flaming urns, which probably represent the saints in this basilica. The large entrance block was built around 1742. An old report says that the sculpture could be seen across the courtyard when the door of the basilica was open. Maps and drawings. (1474), Piana di Roma, by Alessandro Strozzi. 1551, La Piana di Roma, by Leonardo Bufalini. Interesting about this map is that the basilica is shown with 2 side chapel in the apse. 1572, Brown and Hogenberg, Roma. 1588, Girolamo Franzini. The front facade of the basilica, as it may have looked around 1588, and as we already know from the model. (1593), La Piana di Roma by Antonio Tempesta. You can see that the inner courtyard is already surrounded by a building. (1676), Map of Rome, by Giovanni Battista Falda. To see, the canthar's face is in the center. Here again, the inner courtyard has already an entrance building. The construction, or reconstruction of the new entrance building, is given in most sources as 1742. 1748, Nuova Topografia di Roma, by Giovanni Battista Nolli. The basilica is listed on the Nolli map as number 146. 1781, Nuova Piana, by Giuseppe Vasi. The basilica is listed on the Vasi map as number 150. We can find a drawing of the basilica from 1758. Also from the same volume is plate 160. To see the back of the basilica with the apse. One of the 3 windows for the apse which are now bricked up, are clearly visible. An interactive map combines Vasi's box with Nolli's map of Rome. With the interactive map you can discover the point of view of the painter. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Saint Cecilia published his Italian journey, in which he tells in 2 books about his experiences on his Italian journey from 1786 to 1788. In Bologna, he visited Raphael's painting of Cecilia, which was already famous at the time. Raphael's altarpiece was commissioned for a chapel dedicated to Saint Cecilia in a church in Bologna. His journey took him on to Rome, where he visited the Basilica of Santa Cecilia on November 22, 1786. The columns were covered with red velvet and entwined with golden braid. The capitals with embroidered velvet in the approximate shape of capitals. All the cornices and pillars were hung and covered. All the spaces between the walls are covered with vividly painted pieces. That the whole church seemed to be covered with mosaic. And over 200 wax candles burned around and beside the high altar, so that the whole of one wall was covered with lights, and the nave of the church was completely illuminated. The side aisles and side altars were equally decorated and illuminated. Against the high altar above, under the organ loft, 2 scaffolds, also covered with velvet, on one of which the singers stood, and on the other the instruments, who played music continuously. The church was packed. Goethe does not mention the Cecilia sculpture by Stefano Maderno. Last major changes to the interior of the basilica. In 1823, the interior was one more time adapted in order to solve structural problems. The ancient columns from the 9th century were overwhelmed by the weight of the 18th century barrel vault. The columns were reinforced, encased with angular pillars, and every second arcade arch was filled. This gave the interior the look we can see today. A stucco of a small organ is located 4 times on the left side and 4 times on the right side. And once, in a carved version above the nun's chair. The design of these organs reminded me of the logo of the Accademia di Santa Cecilia, whereby the organ above the nun's chair has exactly the same number in layout of pipes as the Academy's logo. I do not know whether the logo of the Academy or the small organ above the nun's chair existed first. I think the use of this symbol is probably a tribute to the Accademia or the Basilica. The nunnery from which the Benedictine nuns once came was shut down by the government in 1873. The nuns then moved to their sisters in Trastevere. 20th century. The new crypt. Cardinal Mariano Rampolla, began excavation and restoration work around 1899. In the process, some archaeological finds were made. The old crypt was extended and remodeled. Giovanni Battista Giovanni built the new crypt by order of Cardinal Rampolla around 1900 in a Neo-Byzantine style and historicizing forms. On the right, a chapel in honor of Saint Agnes, on the left, a chapel in honor of Saint Agatha. In the center, the altar of Saint Cecilia. Through the double window in the middle you can see the coffins of the saints. The old crypta had probably existed since the 9th century, but it was kept very simple. If you walk around the confessional, you can also see a chapel at the back, with the mosaics of Urban, Lucius, and Maximus. As in the front, you can look through a grille onto the coffins. The relics of the saints were reburied, whereby the silver box of Saint Cecilia was not opened. The crypt is located below the altar. Visitors can enter the archaeological area in the basement via the left guard room in the entrance area, from where a corridor leads into the new crypt. At this time, the Cappella Rampolla was also added, intended as a funeral chapel for Cardinal Rampolla. In the chapel you can see a masterpiece by Enrico Quattrini, in honor of Cardinal Rampolla. The monument is a mock three-dimensional representation of the newly designed crypt. An angel pulls back the marble curtain to reveal a new crypt, while Cardinal Rampolla admires his work. The monument is at the end of the wall when you look into the chapel through the grille door. Renovations in Cardinal Rampolla's time. The marble apse cladding was probably also made around this time. The windows of the apse were bricked up. On the picture from the year 1758, the windows of the apse can still be seen. You can still recognize the outlines of the windows on the Google Maps images. The fresco paintings by Pietro Cavallini also came back to the surface. Restoring the Basilica. It is said that Cardinal Rampolla wanted to restore the church to their former look, but he was unsuccessful. Another basilica in Rome was successfully rebuilt at this time. The Basilica of San Giovanni a Porta Latina was successfully restored in the 20th century. The Baroque transformations were removed. What the Basilica of Santa Cecilia maybe would look like if it were also restored. The semicircular windows of the Basilica of Cecilia, that we know from the 16th century drawing by Girolamo, may have looked like the windows of this basilica. Interesting to note, the Tower of San Giovanni a Porta Latina looks similar to the tower of the Basilica Sicilia from the drawing of Giuseppe Vasi in 1758. In any case, the effort and loss of art would probably be far too big to rebuild the Basilica of Santa Cecilia to a former look. The basilica got a new organ. Monastery Chronicles. In November the new organ was installed. It was built in Turin by the Gazebo factory, which took back the old organ. The new one is very valuable, and of unsurpassable sweetness. The organ consists of 2 ivory and ebony keyboards. The drive system is pneumatic. Air is supplied by an electric blower. Originally, the air was supplied by manual pumping. The organ was placed between 2 pillars, in the middle of the nave. Most of the pipes are located in the rear part. The courtyard. When the basilica was built, an atrium was added. The atrium was later replaced by a forecourt, surrounded by monastery buildings. Most of the modifications to the monastery buildings in the inner courtyard that are still visible today date from the 15th century. As you can see on old maps, the inner courtyard was probably enclosed on all sides very early. When Ferdinando Fuga redesigned the facade of the basilica, he also lowered the surface of the inner courtyard to the level of the church floor. But at some point, it was moved to the right side. It is a handle vase, also called cantharus. Sources say that it dates from the 2nd century and that it was brought by Pope Paschal to the basilica. The exact origin of this cantharus is unknown. The vase was probably used as a purification fountain. A purification fountain was part of early Christian architecture of basilicas. A new entrance building was added in the 18th century. In a painted picture by Giuseppe Vasi, you can see what the inner courtyard looked like in 1758. In 1929, a new fountain was built in the middle of the inner courtyard, and the cantharus vase was placed in the middle. In 1929, the courtyard was transformed into a garden with a low boxwood hedge. The vase in the middle of the fountain, forming the centerpiece. The inner courtyard was redesigned very soon again. The hedge was removed and replaced with roses and other plants. The basilica, as you can see and visit today in Rome Trastevere.